So, welcome to this presentation recorded in the South Pacific nation of Aotearoa, New Zealand. Tēnā koutou katoa. Hello, everybody. When research becomes a dirty word, this, of course, references Linda Tuhawai-Smith's iconic book, Decolonizing Research Methodologies. Was brought to my attention by my colleague Gillian Howell in Melbourne not long ago. And it brought me back to some real essentials and some thoughts about research and how we constantly have to reevaluate our methods to make sure they're really benefiting the communities we work into. So I have prepared two presentations. The first was presented for ICCM and archived on their YouTube channel. It was contextual and macro level. The second presentation for the Community Music Learning Network is more detailed and unpacks the specifics of research design from my position as an Indigenous person. I did that because I felt I knew there was linkage between these two presentations across these two forums and we would share some audiences. So while these are discrete offerings, they have been calibrated to move through significant key areas in a methodical way. That being said, we cover some similar ground in this presentation, but for the most part, we just dig down a little deeper into some concepts. You wouldn't have had to see the first one in order to understand this, and it might be interesting to go back to the first one having seen this. So it doesn't really matter which way around we watch them. So full disclosure, before I begin this presentation, I always say to my postgraduate research students, you need to identify the team you play for when you're writing. And when you're reading research studies, you need to identify the team the research team or researchers play for. It really nuances the way you interpret the data. So I am an opera singer by training and vocation. At this time, my core business is teaching voice students to appreciate and perform the art objects from the European tradition. My work, I work in a university context at a school of music based on a hybrid model that integrates the conservatory traditions of 19th century Western Europe and the Northern American higher music education models that together, arguably, provide a music education through what is globally understood as the music's signature pedagogies. That being said, what is relevant to this presentation is that I work in a colonial context of Aotearoa, New Zealand, and you can see that there on the beautiful South Pacific, and I am Indigenous Maori. To place these inherited practices, and by this I include teaching, performing, and research practices into my context, without considering the deep-rooted tensions associated with our specific colonial history, is, in my opinion, anatoptic and anachronistic and requires some deeper level of critical analysis. I'd like to talk now about my journey to CMA, again, just to position myself. I came to community music through a research project undertaken at the request of Maori leaders working in the Indigenous community performance genre, kapa haka. In brief, kapa haka is a mode of community music and dance that lifts up and sustains Maori language, traditions, and rituals. In terms of Maori identity, for some pan-tribal and urban Maori, Te Rito Papish suggests that kapa haka acts as a surrogate, replacing familial and ancestral ties broken by generations of colonization and cultural suppression. This type of community music is a strategy employed by Maori and Indigenous Pacific Island communities living in my context to mitigate the impact of historical trauma. So the first CMA commission gathering I attended was in Corfu in 2012, and I reported on that kapa haka project. I thought back on that first encounter with the field in 2019 when the International Society for Music Education, ISME, called for responses to a proposal to create a special interest group, Decolonizing and Indigenizing Music Education. My response to ISME began with a question for the subcommittee to consider. Is there currently a culturally safe place for Indigenous peoples and their allies to gather and discuss their issues within the ISME collective? Clearly rhetorical. I went on to clarify that any answer to that specific question should probably come from an Indigenous person's experience of Ismay, if it is to have any credibility with and relevance to Indigenous peoples. So in response to my own question, I said no and supported the proposal because I felt the time was right for Ismay to create a culturally and psychologically safe space for the exploration of new knowledge-making systems, different worldviews, and different value systems that could emerge for all music educators from this specific special interest group. I also encouraged the subcommittee to gaze on this proposal from an Indigenous perspective and with an empathy that embraces the socio-political and historical context that has contributed to the contemporary world in which Indigenous peoples make music, teach, and receive music. With that in mind, I outlined why, as an Indigenous academic, I had found the Community Music Activities Commission a space within Ismay that I could trust. To me, the practitioners and researchers in this area had proven themselves capable of actively discussing music issues and potential resolutions emerging from a politically charged context. Having said that, I have been with the Commission since 2012, and the growth in the understanding of diversity and its subcategory, indigeneity, has largely been through the inclusive participation of Indigenous peoples and capable research allies who have designed appropriate research with and for Indigenous communities. Why critique CM methodologies? So scholars from a range of community music sites across many different regions and practitioners and academics working across ethnomusicology, music philosophy, music education, music therapy, just to name a few, are reshaping our field and adding critical discussions to the literature. Some may believe the contributions from such a variety of music specializations validates the value and existence of community music as a field. Some may see it as problematizing its legitimacy, as it becomes an area of research and practice where some just graze in the field, if you will, and are unwilling to undertake intense scholarly interrogation of the practices or scholarship. For me, at this moment in my academic and musical life, I find the occasional bites at the edge of community music research, especially around rigor, meta-analysis, or lack of, and critical interrogation, interesting and invigorating. It is not my intent in this presentation to critically investigate the field of community music research, although this will probably be an incidental outcome of this discussion, but rather to change the filter and view our field through another lens. As a researcher of Indigenous heritage, I am interested in the historic discourse about the other as it is represented in the narratives and scholarly constructs of researchers, a discourse that was historically often informal and anecdotal, but because in the past it achieved scholarly status and was archived in the cultural and academic institutions of the West, continues to reinforce its view of itself as the center of legitimate knowledge. So where is music education in this discussion? Well, part of my journey revolves around reconciling issues that arise from my teaching learning context. Explicitly, the focus on critique and the associated practices within classical performance training that as an academic, Indigenous academic, I find challenge my collective's values and can directly conflict with Maori measures of health and well-being. In the field of community music, I have found enormous satisfaction and, to cite Tia Denora, moments of respite from the daily encounters with individualism, competitiveness, and the uplifting of the settler traditions that are central to music education. In fact, community music as a field and a musicking site has helped me make sense of the wider music education world, which I often find narrow and systematically challenging. To participate in the music education sector from an Indigenous perspective is to be obsessed with the elevation of the arts practices and traditions of Western Europe, and therefore in a deliberate way contribute to the ongoing positional superiority of Western knowledge and culture. This has clear linkage to concerns in many other discipline areas, particularly with respect to research practices. Music education reinforces this cultural archive in such a way that its narrow scope and limited evaluative schema are often the measures used to legitimize the value of all music practices. In an increasingly volatile world, where marginalized communities are advocating for the decentralizing of political and institutional policies that deliberately exclude some communities and promote systemic racism, it is perhaps relevant to bring to this forum the way we research into community music and what we can learn from researchers who have been working in the field of Indigenous and non-Western research methodologies. But first, let's talk about what the others are doing. So Lee Higgins and Patricia Campbell place community music halfway between music education and ethnomusicology. While I argue that the wider area of music education is still challenged to think beyond the inherited practices of the Western cultural archive, there is increasing evidence that ethnomusicologists have recognized the need to critique their own research processes. Sado, for example, and some have challenged the discipline, calling for those working with Indigenous peoples to take personal responsibility, to engage epistemologically, methodologically, and ontologically. I quote McKinley. As mentioned in the first presentation, I would take the advice of my colleague Elena Curtis, an Indigenous researcher in the field of medical health sciences, and include axiology in that list. In any case, these ethnomusicologist scholars can offer some perspective to the field of community music. Their progressiveness, perhaps in part because of all the music-related research sites, it has the most to prove with respect to responsible researching. It is, after all, historically entwined with anthropology, arguably one of the social science sites that has inappropriately researched and damaged Indigenous communities historically. That being said, a new generation of researchers articulate a new perspective. Sado writes, accepting the coloniality of power and of knowledges is also accepting the existence of a kind of epistemic hegemony of colonial origin, which hides other possibilities of understanding the world. So, why design matters? What Indigenous academics have to offer our field? Well, in my context, the drivers behind Indigenous research protocols are claimed by Linda Tuhawaii-Smith to be straightforward. Colonized peoples' struggles for self-determination, survival of their culture and language. This framework has led to a more critical and reflexive approaches to research and the search for more favorable conditions for researching into and with Indigenous communities. These include resolving methodological issues which may hinder the research that it benefits and extends our community's knowledge. I would argue that Indigenous worldviews align with much of the literature that describes the aspirations of community music and offers useful models for researchers. To cite Linda Smith, Indigenous peoples offer genuine alternatives to the current dominant form of development. Indigenous peoples have philosophies which connect humans to the environment and to each other, which generate principles for living a life which is sustainable, respective, and possible. Margaret Kovac notes the layers of difficulty in bridging cultural paradigms within research most often begin at the level of individual word choice. So to clarify, when Smith speaks about methodology, she refers to the conceptual framework or theory that is suitable for addressing the intent of the research question. This may draw on existing methodological approaches or Indigenous knowledge, or a mix. This framework guides the design of the method or methods used to gather the evidence and can draw on existing tools or culturally derived methods. For Curtis, methodology represents the theory of how knowledge is gained and outlines an appropriate approach to systematic inquiry. She understands in research that methodology is impacted by ontology, that is what is seen to be real or what will be examined, epistemology, how we know what is real, or the sources of knowledge that will be used, and axiology, the values that underpin finding out or researching more. Understanding the complex nature of what Indigenous worldview encompasses is assisted by an exploration beyond methodology to also understand the role of ontology, axiology, and epistemology. Methodology and theory can be considered contested terms, according to Kovac, in that they are inherently Western ideas and for some Indigenous not compatible with Indigenous ways of knowing. However, like Kovac, I use Indigenous methodologies in the plural and use this to describe the theory and methods for conducting research that flows from the Indigenous epistemologies and use it interchangeably with the term framework. As this presentation is critically considering research methodologies in the field of community music, I would like to briefly outline conceptual frameworks that offer an alternative to the normal Eurocentric practices. These historic approaches that have been shown by post-colonial theorists and Indigenous academics to be inadequate for dealing with the legacies of violence that have occurred in the colonized world. I regaze at community music from these non-Western perspectives and through the lens of historical trauma and alongside one alternative framework, just an example, the Indigenous research theory kaupapa Māori, most easily translated as the Maori way of doing things. As a framework, this theoretical approach has had over 3 decades of precedent among Māori-led research initiatives and has made significant contributions to the development of projects that benefit Māori communities. The literature around kaupapa Māori as a concept is comprehensive. However, as a prelude to this brief discussion, I use the definition provided by Main, who describes it as an academic approach that originates in Māori concepts, cultural practices, and epistemologies, and considers Māori both as individuals and as collective members of community in working towards advancing the well-being of the collective. For those of us that work at the intersection of population health and community music, Mason Dury, a psychiatrist and researcher responsible for transforming the way health professionals think about Māori health, described kaupapa Māori as a critique of colonization linked to political marginalization, discontent, and dislocation, but has grown as an ideology to include thriving as Māori and using the Māori way to achieve the best possible results for Māori. When used with historical trauma theory, these two concepts have been described by Pihama et al. As theoretical allies. So just to remind us of how the literature defines historical trauma is described by Mohat et al. As a complex and collective trauma experienced over time and across generations by a group of people who share an identity, affiliation, or circumstance. Kirkmeyer et al. Suggest that the concept obtains its rhetorical force by consolidating two pre-existing constructs: historical oppression and psychological trauma. Smallwood et al. In their 2020 systematic review of evidence-based literature provide examples from multiple studies suggesting historical trauma continues to impact young Indigenous people across Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. There is an increasing body of critical conversations already in progress around the impacts of historical trauma on Indigenous communities, some of it emerging from music fields. But as a background concept in all research, it has the potential to pull to the surface new possibilities, new learning, and illuminate other ways of obtaining new knowledge. I expand on the notion of kaupapa Māori research and the code of practice that researchers are expected to employ when working with Māori and their communities. Within the design, there is an expectation that the processes they will utilize to ensure all stages of the research study occur in a culturally appropriate manner are explicit and have been negotiated and approved by community members. In practice, this means that every step of the research study is scrutinized by the team to ensure that the participants and researchers are operating within a culturally safe site. The design is grounded in Maori knowledge by privileging Maori cultural norms, Maori concepts, and a Maori culturally informed position. Monitoring all aspects of the project will be elders or advisors with sufficient cultural knowledge, and in some cases, discipline knowledge. External to the study, they should be capable of advising on the cultural appropriateness of the research design and the quality of research tools selected, so as not to distract from Māori epistemologies. The tools used can be varied, and to cite Ponton, this means that the practices may change, but the values and foundations of the cultural traditions remain. So I'd like to end today with an example of a robust research design that answers the questions posed in part 1. This application was successfully submitted to the Ethics Committee in 2020. I extract the portion of the research design submitted for interviews to the Māori participants that respond to the questions around cultural responsiveness. So at this point, can I suggest that you pause and read these in your own time? There are 2 slides related to this research design, and I won't talk about them in this presentation. I'll leave them to you to look at. Here's the second page. And you'll see I'm doing my best to make sure that I've translated certain concepts and labels for you. At the end of the first part 1 presentation, I put up some ethics questions, the questions that guide ethical decisions or ethics committees' decisions about the viability of a research project. And so I wanted to bring this to you because, not only should you be able to answer all of these questions and more, not all of them are pertinent necessarily to your design, from the research design, like it should be explicit in there and you should be able to answer them. But I encourage you all to consider now, forever and ever, when you read research studies, and it doesn't matter what the field is, but when you do read research studies, that you ask yourself these questions, because it's not only about what team these researchers play for, but also how, where they've chosen their participants. If it's a global representation or if it's an appropriate representation according to the research intent. There are lots of ways of unpacking studies. I personally have a struggle when people talk about global representation and they've only had perhaps a selection of participants from universities in the Western world, or even in North America alone, or perhaps in the UK. You know, I mean, that's unusual now, but there are research, these to me are mitigations and limitations often when you look at a research question from our perspective. So yeah, this page or this slide you can look at answers those questions from that design. And then of course, here's some readings for you. I have included 2 of my own that are quite recent. One is an auto-ethnographic. The other one is really revolving around a specific project that uses Pacific research methodologies. I have not spoken to this today because I am not a Pacifica person, I'm Maori. However, in New Zealand, we have a wonderful body of literature and research around appropriate non-Western methodologies for Pacific Island people, because that is, we come from the Pacific and they are our cousins and they're a very important minority in New Zealand. And so the academics and scholars in that area have a very strong voice and are quite influential. So in this one, I use the word talanoa. You'll see it here, Community Music in South Pacific talanoa, which is actually a research tool derived from Pacific cultures. We also have it in Māori. And within that research project, I had research assistants who were Pacifica who were guiding it. So Of course, the Smith book is really, really important, iconic, I think. Younging was the elements of Indigenous style that was given to me, or suggested to me by one of the members of the Indigenous steering group for decolonizing and indigenizing music education. And I love it. And I think if you're in the North America, or particularly in Canada, that's an essential reading for a young researcher. And Yunka Porter, of course, beautiful. If you want idiosyncratic Indigenous use of language, that's a beautiful book. And again, it's the Australian region. Pardon me. It's the Australian region, and I think you should be reading these books if you're young researchers in that area. And finally, the references. So there's 2 pages of references. I haven't always mentioned who I'm citing, but I have cited many of these for you, so there you go. And yeah, it's been a pleasure sharing this time with you, and I hope you have a wonderful time exploring these ideas and concepts, and they bring something new to your academic trajectory. So kia ora tātou katoa. Thank you for being here.